A subway system runs on an agreement nobody riding it ever thinks about, that somewhere, someone always knows exactly where every train is, at every moment, closely enough to stop two of them from occupying the same stretch of track at the same time. For most of the history of underground rail, that agreement was kept by hand, a system of signal blocks, physical sections of track that only ever held one train at a time, tracked and released by dispatchers reading paper boards and throwing manual levers, a discipline that took years to learn and decades to master. My name is Colette Marchetti. I've worked for the Metro Transit Authority for 35 years, the last 19 as Chief Rail Traffic Controller for the River Line, the system's busiest and oldest route, running beneath the river that splits this city in two. This is a story about the evening the newest, most sophisticated piece of technology this agency has ever installed went dark in the middle of rush hour, and about my son, who'd spent 3 years convincing the agency that nobody would need what I still remembered how to do. The Metro Transit Authority completed its rollout of TrackFlow, an AI-driven train control and collision avoidance system, across the entire subway network 4 years before this story's events, replacing the manual block signaling that had governed train separation since the system opened in 1932 with continuous, automated positioning and collision avoidance calculations processed across a dense fiber optic sensor network threaded through every tunnel in the city. TrackFlow was, by any honest measure, a genuine achievement, capable of running trains closer together, more efficiently, and with fewer human errors than manual block signaling had ever reliably managed, credited across its 4 years of operation with measurably reducing delays and allowing the system to add capacity on routes that had been running at their physical limit for over a decade. Its published uptime record, across those 4 years, exceeded 99.9%, a statistic the agency's public communications office referenced constantly, in press releases, in budget hearings, in exactly the kind of confident language that eventually convinces an institution to stop planning seriously for the 0.1% that statistic quietly left unaccounted for. My son Julian, 38 years old, had spent the previous 3 years as the authority's Director of Automation Strategy, the executive most directly responsible for expanding TrackFlow's coverage and, more controversially within the agency, for a workforce restructuring plan that reduced the system's manual backup signal operators from 12 positions across the network down to 3, redirecting the resulting budget savings toward extending TrackFlow's sensor coverage to 2 additional lines that had never previously had any automated signaling at all. TrackFlow's uptime SLA is 99.9%, Mom, he told me, during a budget review meeting I'd been invited to specifically because the Riverline's manual backup staffing was on the list of proposed reductions. 12 dedicated manual operators sitting largely idle, system-wide, isn't a responsible use of a budget that could expand automated coverage to lines that currently have none at all. 3 regional backup operators can cover any single, isolated automated system failure. 99.9% still leaves roughly 9 hours a year where something, somewhere on this network, isn't working the way it's supposed to, Julian. The question that actually matters isn't the average. It's whether the specific 9 hours that do happen land somewhere 3 regional operators can actually reach in time, and whether anyone left on this system still remembers how to run a block manually once they get there. I want to be fair to what Julian was actually balancing, because it wasn't recklessness, and it wasn't indifference to safety. The 2 additional automated lines genuinely needed the investment, genuinely served neighborhoods that had waited over a decade for reliable modern signaling, and the specific argument he was making, that widely distributed idle backup capacity was an inefficient way to manage a genuinely rare failure mode, was one that plenty of capable transit engineers across the industry were making at agencies across the country during roughly the same period. I'd raised my son to think carefully about trade-offs, to weigh competing goods honestly rather than pretending any resource decision was ever entirely simple, and there was a specific, complicated pride sitting underneath my disagreement with him in that budget meeting, watching him make exactly the kind of careful, defensible argument I'd have respected from any colleague, delivered by someone I'd once taught to tie his shoes in a break room not unlike the one we were sitting in now. The specific vulnerability I'd flagged, repeatedly, across the 2 years leading up to this story, concerned the Riverline's primary fiber trunk, the physical cable carrying TrackFlow's sensor and control data through the tunnel beneath the river connecting the city's 2 halves. Unlike most of the system's more recently constructed sections, the river tunnel's fiber infrastructure ran through a single conduit installed during a 2015 signaling upgrade, without the redundant secondary pathway that had been built into every other tunnel section added during TrackFlow's original installation. I'd walked that tunnel myself more times than I could count over the years, both before and after TrackFlow's installation, and I'd developed, across those years, a very specific, very physical unease about the exposed conduit run along one particular access junction where the fiber emerged briefly from its protective casing to connect to a relay box before disappearing back underground, a section that happened to sit, as it turned out, almost directly beneath the street where a utility crew would eventually be doing unrelated emergency repairs. I'd requested a redundant fiber pathway for the river tunnel specifically in 3 consecutive annual capital planning cycles, each time citing the tunnel's singular importance as the only connection between the system's east and west halves, and each time watching the request get deprioritized against competing capital needs, including, in the most recent cycle, the same automated expansion to the 2 previously unsignaled lines that Julian's workforce restructuring plan had been designed to fund. I remember the specific frustration of watching that request move down the priority list for a 3rd consecutive year, not because anyone had directly rejected my reasoning, but because the abstract, statistically unlikely nature of the risk I was describing simply couldn't compete. In a limited capital budget, against tangible, visible improvements serving neighborhoods that had waited years for basic modern signaling at all. I understand the river tunnel's a single point of failure, Mom. I've read your capital request 3 years running. The engineering risk assessment rated the probability of a physical fiber cut in that specific section as extremely low, and extremely low probability, system-critical single points of failure exist all over infrastructure this old. We can't fund redundancy for every one of them simultaneously. You're not wrong about the probability being low, Julian. I'm telling you the consequence, if it happens during rush hour with 3 trains a minute running through that tunnel, isn't something a low probability makes acceptable to leave unaddressed indefinitely. There's a difference between an acceptable risk and a risk nobody's gotten around to funding yet. He didn't have a satisfying answer to that, and to his credit, he didn't pretend to. What he had, instead, was a genuinely difficult resource allocation problem across an entire system with more legitimate capital needs than budget to fund them, and a professional judgment, made in good faith, that the river tunnel's risk, however real, ranked below several other priorities competing for the same limited funding. I left that meeting the way I'd left the 2 before it, unsatisfied but unable to point to anything in his reasoning I could call clearly wrong, only a discomfort I couldn't yet translate into an argument persuasive enough to move the number on a budget spreadsheet. The incident that exposed the gap between that judgment and its actual consequences happened on an ordinary Thursday evening in March, during the 5:40 p.m. peak, when an unrelated municipal utility crew, performing emergency water main repairs on a street above the river tunnel's access point, struck and severed the primary fiber conduit with excavation equipment. An accident entirely unconnected to anything the transit authority had done or failed to do, and entirely unpreventable by any risk. Assessment focused on the tunnel's own infrastructure rather than the unrelated utility work happening above it. I learned the details afterward, secondhand, from the utility crew's own incident report: a burst water main, an emergency call, a crew working under genuine time pressure of their own, none of them aware that the narrow conduit beneath their excavation carried anything more critical than routine municipal cabling. TrackFlow's collision avoidance and positioning system for the entire river tunnel section went dark instantaneously, at 5:43 p.m., during the single busiest 15-minute window of the entire day, with 4 trains already committed to movements within the tunnel section and a 5th, an express service running express through the tunnel without local stops, approaching the tunnel entrance at full speed with no way for its operator to know the automated system that normally governed the tunnels. Train separation had just stopped functioning entirely. I was in the Riverline control room when the alarm cascade hit, watching TrackFlow's status board across the entire tunnel section flip, within seconds, from its normal steady green indicators to a uniform, silent red, not an alarm state the system was designed to actively announce, because a total sensor network failure of that scope was precisely the kind of extremely low probability event the system's own designers, and Julian's risk assessment, had never fully built out and automated. Fallback Protocol 4. My newest dispatcher, a capable young man named Theo who'd been trained entirely on TrackFlow's interface across his 18 months with the authority and had never once, in his training, been required to run a live manual block signaling exercise, looked at me with an expression of genuine, blank panic, the kind of panic I recognized instantly because I'd worn it myself, decades earlier. The first time a system I'd trusted completely had simply stopped telling me anything useful at all. I don't know how to see where the trains are, Colette. The board's just red. All of it. What do I do? I remember the specific steadiness I forced into my own voice answering him, a steadiness I didn't entirely feel in that first instant but that 35 years of exactly this kind of moment had taught me to produce on command, because whatever I actually felt, the two of us in that room needed my voice to sound like someone who already knew what came next. What I did, in the 90 seconds that followed, drew on a discipline I hadn't actively practiced in nearly 2 decades, since the years before TrackFlow's rollout when manual block signaling had still been the Riverline's everyday method of operation, but that 35 years in this control room had apparently kept alive somewhere deeper than active practice. The way a language learned in childhood stays retrievable long after you've stopped speaking it daily. My hands found the drawer beneath my console almost before my conscious mind had finished registering what the red board actually meant, the same drawer I hadn't opened in years, the paper diagram inside slightly yellowed at the edges but otherwise exactly where I'd left it the last time I'd needed it. I pulled the tunnel's physical track diagram from that drawer, a document nobody had updated or referenced in years because TrackFlow had made it functionally obsolete, and began reconstructing the tunnel's train positions from the last confirmed automated readings before the blackout, cross-referenced against radio contact with each train operator individually, a process that would have been instantaneous through TrackFlow and took, working manually, nearly 4 full minutes to establish with confidence. I remember the specific, focused quiet that settled over me during those 4 minutes, a quiet I hadn't experienced in this control room in years, the sound of my own voice on the radio the only thing anchoring 5 trains full of people to a coherent, shared picture of where they actually were. Riverline control to all trains in the river tunnel section, this is an emergency manual block procedure. Automated signaling is down. I need each unit to confirm position and hold at current location until directed. Do not proceed past your current signal point under any circumstances. I radioed the express service directly, the train I was most concerned about given its speed and the reduced margin its schedule allowed for an unplanned stop, and gave the operator a manual hold order roughly 90 seconds before the train would have entered the tunnel's blind section, the specific stretch where, without TrackFlow's real-time positioning, I had no way of confirming with certainty exactly where the 4 trains already inside the tunnel were currently sitting relative to each other. I could hear, in the operator's voice acknowledging my hold order, the same controlled tension I remembered from my own years running trains before I moved into dispatch, the particular discipline of trusting a voice on a radio completely, without visual confirmation, because the entire system depends on that trust holding exactly when it matters most. The express held at the tunnel entrance. I spent the following 11 minutes manually sequencing all 5 trains through the tunnel section one at a time, using a block procedure I hadn't run live in nearly 20 years, walking Theo through each step aloud as I worked, partly to train him in real time and partly, I'll admit honestly, because narrating the procedure out loud was the only way I could be certain I wasn't skipping a step my hands remembered better than my conscious mind did in that specific moment. I watched him writing notes as fast as he could on a legal pad beside the useless red board, and I remember thinking, even in the middle of that 11 minutes, that whatever else came of that evening, at least one more person in this control room would carry this discipline forward afterward. Nobody was hurt. No trains came anywhere close to occupying the same block simultaneously, though I want to be honest that the margin, on 2 of the 5 sequenced movements, was considerably tighter than I'd have found professionally comfortable under less urgent circumstances, close enough that I still think about those 2 specific movements more than the other 3 combined, turning them over the way you turn over the near misses that never quite let you go. The utility crew's fiber cut was repaired within 6 hours, TrackFlow's river tunnel section came back online just after midnight, and by the following morning's commute, the entire incident was, from a passenger's perspective, nothing more than a brief, unexplained slowdown during Thursday's evening rush. Julian called me that night, close to 11 p.m., having heard about the incident through the authorities' internal reporting chain before I'd had a chance to call him myself. I could hear, in the particular quality of the silence before he spoke, that he'd already spent several hours doing exactly the arithmetic I'd expected him to eventually do. You ran a full manual block sequence with a dispatcher who'd never done one before, on a system where I cut backup staffing from 12 to 3. I did, Julian. And it worked, because I still remembered how, and because I was standing in that control room instead of one of the 3 regional operators who might have been 40 minutes away when it mattered. I need to say this directly, Mom. If you'd retired last year, the way you talked about doing before I asked you to stay on the Riverline through this transition, if it had been anyone else in that chair tonight, someone who trained entirely on track flow the way Theo did, I don't know what happens to those 4 trains in that tunnel. I didn't argue with him, because I'd done the same arithmetic myself, standing in that control room watching a 5th train hold at the tunnel entrance based on nothing but a radio call and 35 years of muscle memory nobody currently being trained on this system was being taught to develop. I thought, listening to him on the phone that night, about how strange it was to hear my own son finally arrive at the exact fear I'd been quietly carrying through 3 budget cycles of unfunded capital requests, arriving at it not through my arguments, which he'd read and respected and ultimately deprioritized anyway, but through 4 trains and 11 minutes that could have gone very differently. The authorities' formal incident review, completed 6 weeks later, recommended restoring manual backup staffing to something closer to its previous level system-wide, and specifically mandated that every dispatcher, regardless of track flow certification, complete recurring manual block signaling training on a fixed annual schedule going forward, a genuinely meaningful policy change, and one Julian championed personally through the review process, using the river tunnel incident as the case. That finally moved a recommendation his own department had quietly resisted funding for 3 prior budget cycles. What the review didn't do, and what I hadn't particularly expected it to do, was offer any acknowledgement of the specific, uncomfortable fact sitting underneath the whole incident, that the authority had, for the better part of 2 years, been retaining me past the point I'd have otherwise chosen to retire, not through any formal policy or explicit request, but through a quieter, more diffuse institutional reluctance to fully confront how much of the system's actual resilience during exactly this kind of rare, high-consequence failure depended on a small handful of senior staff whose specific manual expertise nobody had built a real plan to preserve once we were gone. I retired 4 months after the river tunnel incident, not pushed out the way I might have been years earlier under a different kind of institutional pressure, but on my own terms, at a moment I chose myself, having watched the policy changes I'd been requesting for years finally get funded, and having spent my last months training 3 new dispatchers, Theo among them, in the specific, unglamorous discipline of running a subway tunnel by hand, the way I'd learned it from a controller who retired the year I started, 35 years earlier, in a control room that looked almost nothing like the one I finally walked out of for the last time. I remember my last shift specifically, an unremarkable Tuesday morning, deliberately unremarkable, because I'd wanted to leave the way I'd worked for 35 years, without ceremony, the trains running exactly the way they were supposed to, nothing about that final morning distinguishing itself from 10,000 mornings before it except the specific knowledge, private to me, that I wouldn't be back the following day. Theo still calls me sometimes, months into running his own shifts now, usually with a genuine question about a manual procedure rather than an emergency, and I find I don't mind those calls at all, the same way I imagine my own predecessor didn't mind mine, decades ago, when I was the one still building the confidence he'd apparently trusted me with far sooner than I trusted myself. Julian and I talk most weeks now, about the authority's ongoing manual training program, about the 2 new lines TrackFlow's expansion eventually reached, about a system that runs, today, closer together and more efficiently than it ever did in my early years, and still depends, in the specific 9 hours a year the statistics quietly account for, on someone standing in a control room who remembers what to do when the red board goes silent and stops offering any answers at all. A subway system still runs on an agreement nobody riding it ever thinks about. I've spent 35 years being part of what keeps that agreement, and the last part of my career teaching 3 people how to keep it themselves, the same patient, unglamorous way somebody once taught me, long before either TrackFlow or my son's entire career existed to make it look, for a while, like nobody would ever need to remember how again.